Conflict is escalating in Israel at this hour, with Hamas missiles reaching the biggest city, Tel Aviv, and Israeli forces retaliating. Israeli airstrikes destroyed a tower block in Gaza City. The military say the building was connected to Hamas intelligence, but it also housed international media organizations, including the Associated Press. The building's owner said the occupants were warned and left the site. I'm now joined by journalist Hazem Balusha in Gaza City. Hazem, thanks for joining us. Tell us about the moment this building came down.
Well, the building, Jala building, is one of the old buildings in Gaza City. It is the third building that contains the media outlets' offices in Gaza. I mean, actually, 4 high buildings were flattened, but this is the third that contains press offices. It has the Al Jazeera office for Arabic and English service, as well as the American news agency Associated Press. It was a very sad moment for the journalists who are working there. I'm not sure how many other media outlets are stayed or posted there, but there are some others as well, along with other residential apartments for ordinary people. This building was hit after 1 hour. There was a warning by the Israeli intelligence services to the owner of the building. It gave him an hour, and he asked for 10 minutes more for some journalists to bring down their cameras, but he refused. 3 warning rockets from a drone were hit the building. Then it was hit by a heavy warplane and flattened down.
Hazem, people are watching this, no doubt, and scratching their heads and trying to figure out why this building was targeted. So the guessing game starts. You know, were there any Hamas or Islamic Jihad offices or connections, as far as you know, in this building?
Well, usually the Hamas and other factions, they have their secret offices. I can't say that they have offices there. They might be, but I mean, they have governmental offices, which is where targeted as well. But these buildings, like Israelis targeted some apartments, not the whole buildings. But this time they flattened the whole building. Even if there is, some people are wondering why the Israelis are not targeting these apartments or flats in case there was that or owned or stayed by activists from Hamas or Islamic Jihad. This building is not a new building. It's there since long time, and it's not out of sudden. There are some Hamas people there. So it was shocking and it was incredible. It's in the center of Gaza City, and it's surrounded by many high buildings. So I'm sure that these neighboring or next door buildings were damaged as well.
We understand that Hamas has been reacting to this bombing. What exactly have they been saying?
Well, Hamas is always, and in particular the military wing of Hamas, Qassam brigades, saying that Israelis are targeting civilian buildings, and in response to that, they fire and launch rocket into Israel. In the first time when they targeted the first high building, they respond with rockets into Tel Aviv, and every time there is a Israeli airstrike on raised buildings, they fire rockets into Israel, mainly the center of Israel. And the latest statement was by the spokesman of the Qassam brigades, and said that after destroying the civilian building, Israel, Tel Aviv and central Israel has to stand on one leg and waiting for our shocking response. So it means that the Qassam brigades might launch rockets into Israel again.
Hazem Balusha in Gaza City, where seemingly minute by minute there's more news to report. Many thanks.
You're welcome.
Let's bring in now Jerusalem correspondent Tanya Kramer. Tanya, you've been reporting now from the Israeli army on that media building in Gaza brought down this afternoon. Bring us up to date on what they are saying.
Well, they actually released a statement very shortly after the building was brought down. And according to that statement, and I will read you parts of it, a quote from it, it contained, that's a quote, military assets belonging to the intelligence offices of the Hamas terror organization. It continues to say the building contains civilian media offices, which the Hamas terror organization hides behind and uses as human shields. It also says that Hamas, and that's a quote again, deliberately places military targets at the heart of densely populated civilian areas in the Gaza Strip. And they also stressed in this statement that they had given advance warning and sufficient time for residents and for people there for evacuating the building.
You yourself have worked out of that building, Tanya. I was going to ask you whether there was anything that could have justified that strike, but it's clear that what they're telling you is that there was clearly a connection to Hamas and other so-called terrorist organizations.
Well, as my colleague Hazem Balusha in Gaza also said, I mean, we've seen that throughout the past days in this conflict that, you know, the Israeli army has targeted several high-rise or larger buildings, mainly in Gaza City, saying that they housed or they were, you know, the home to offices, infrastructure belonging to Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Now, but again, this is a huge building, and it houses not just international media like AP or Al Jazeera, which are reporting as well on this conflict from there, but it houses also, you know, residential units, flats for people. And we've seen that now time and time again in these high-rise buildings that people are made homeless as well.
Clearly, we have to play devil's advocate here, and there are some people who will say this is just clearly a convenient excuse on the part of the Israeli defense. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think you have to ask that the Israeli media spokesperson of the Israeli army why they targeted. I mean, they put a very clear statement out why they targeted this building, and that we have seen this over the past day in this conflict, that they're saying they're targeting infrastructure by the militant groups. The question is, and also my colleague Hazem Balusha in Gaza pointed that out, whether they always have to bring the whole building down or whether they target sometimes they only target also apartments or certain sites within a building.
Attacks have certainly been launched from both sides. Hamas has been escalating its rocket offensive on Tel Aviv. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, absolutely. We've seen that today, very severe rocket barrages in several waves, actually within a very short time, around midday. That time, again, targeting central Israel, mainly also Tel Aviv and surrounding cities. We've seen, it appears to that several rockets actually made impact there, and one of the rockets made impact in a residential building in Ramat Gan that's just next to Tel Aviv, where one person died, a man, a civilian, died from that rocket strike. But of course, also rocket barrages continue throughout, in the morning, and even now, we are getting constant alerts for this in the south, surrounding the Gaza Strip, in the south and southern cities.
A U.S. envoy is there now to meet with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. There is a UN Security Council meeting tomorrow. Can international efforts get this conflict back under control?
Well, this is still to see. I mean, this conflict has, again, I mean, today in the past hours, we are reporting on it, has intensified again. It's the 6th day now, and at the same time, there are more and more reports as well that we read in the Israeli media and in the Arab media that mediation efforts are underway. Mediation is usually being done by Egypt, by Qatar, by the United Nations, other actors. They have in previous rounds of conflicts, also during the wars, they have mediated between Hamas and Israel. The question is really whether both parties, have reached whatever they see as their achievements, whether they're prepared now to end this round of very severe and intense hostilities.
DW's indefatigable Tanya Kramer. Thank you, Tanya. Earlier, we spoke to Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conriquez, international spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces. He joined us from Ramat Gan near Tel Aviv, where one Israeli man was killed in a Hamas rocket attack. We started by asking about that attack.
I can tell you that this is now the 6th day of fighting. Hamas and other terrorists have fired more than 2,300 rockets, like the one that impacted here. What you can see behind me, by the way, are the rescue efforts, and they're now taking away the remainder of the bomb. But more than 2,300 rockets have been fired at our cities, at our civilians. And as you said, unfortunately, there is an Israeli fatality here. A man, middle-aged man, who has nothing to do with Gaza, nothing to do with fighting. He was in his home, and he is now dead because of a Hamas rocket that was fired.
The IDF is obviously seeking to defend Israelis from these Hamas attacks from Gaza, but is its response proportionate?
Yes, it is. Our response is very proportionate. Imagine yourself living in your home city, in your capital city, and having your capital bombarded by rockets, by a terrorist organization that knows no law, no boundaries, and has total disregard for human life. Our response is a measured, professional, and precise response, and we are targeting the terrorists and their infrastructure, and we try our best. Even in these very difficult circumstances, when our civilians are targeted, we try our best to limit any accidental casualties to non-combatants.
Well, 10 people were killed in one of the latest Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, 2 women and 8 children. Those are hardly legitimate targets, are they, sir?
Well, the target in that specific event was a senior Hamas leader. I cannot yet disclose his name, but that was a senior Hamas leader. We're looking into the details of that specific event, what happened, who was with him, and the entire situation around him. We know from past experiences that it is a usual tactic of terrorists to have human shields with them and around them at all times, so that if anything happens, then the world will focus on collateral damage and not on the fact that we targeted a terrorist. And I can assure you unequivocally that we do not target anything that isn't terrorist, and if there is collateral accidental damage, that is an unfortunate result, but that is definitely not our intention. We aim to kill terrorists, we aim to degrade their infrastructure and try to create a situation where they cannot fire rockets at our civilians. That's the aim of our operations.
Are you saying very clearly here that those women and children who were killed, women and children who presumably had nothing to do with this conflict, as that Israeli man who was killed had nothing to do with the conflict, are you saying that they were human shields?
I am saying very clearly that Hamas has complete disregard for human life. Hamas embeds itself systematically as a way of practice within the civilian infrastructure. They hide behind schools, mosques, and they also use human shields in order to protect themselves. Their seniors use human shields. Specifically about this event, it is still unclear, and I don't have the final details. But again, I want to reiterate and be very clear. We do not target civilians, we target terrorists. And we try to minimize collateral damage as much as possible. We're not always successful in this, but I can assure you that that is our aspiration. We, contrary to what you see behind me, the impact site in a central city in Israel, are not aiming for the civilians. That is what the terrorists are doing. Our job is to stop the terrorists from executing attacks exactly like this one behind me.
One has to appreciate that it's an extraordinarily difficult task to go after these so-called terrorists and also try to minimize civilian casualty. But doesn't the Israeli military need to do more to prevent civilian casualties in such a high-density area as the Gaza Strip, which, of course, as you know, is one of the most highly populated, highly dense areas in the world?
Yes, you're correct in the fact that it's very dense. It's almost an impossible combat situation. What's really important to keep in mind is that the responsibility here, I don't know if you can hear me, if the line is okay.
We can hear you, sir.
The responsibility here lies with Hamas. They are the ones who, on purpose, embed themselves within civilian infrastructure. If they were outside of civilian infrastructure, then believe me, there wouldn't be a single non-combatant even scratch. But the fact that they choose to dig tunnels under their civilians, to use civilian houses, and to fire their rockets from within the civilian population, sometimes it leaves us no choice but to attack those targets. We do it with the most precise weapons we have. We do it when we can. We give advance warnings about a certain area that is going to be under attack, and we do whatever we can in order to minimize the risk to non-combatants. But you have to understand, Israeli civilians are under fire. We are 6 days and 2,300 rockets of fighting. We have 10 Israeli civilians killed by these rockets. That kind of aggression cannot and will not go unanswered.
There has been some confusion about whether Israel has already launched ground operations in Gaza. What can you tell us, sir?
There are currently no IDF soldiers inside the Gaza Strip.
Well, one Wall Street Journal reporter says you personally gave her explicit confirmation that a ground offensive had begun, and there are several media reports, including from Israeli media, that this was a deliberate ploy by the IDF to lure Hamas fighters into more vulnerable positions. How do you respond to those claims?
I've issued personally a clarification. That was an honest mistake made in a situation where I had the wrong information available, and I provided that information. As soon as it became apparent that it wasn't the correct information, a swift clarification was provided, and we corrected the situation. That was by no means intentional misleading.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, Israeli International Military Spokesman. DW truly appreciates your time, sir.
Thank you.
Most of the latest street violence has been seen in mixed cities in Israel, where Jews and Arabs have been living together for many years. Cities like Acra and Lod were captured by Israeli forces in the 1948 war. Much of the Arab population was displaced as Jewish migration flowed in from overseas. But a large Arab population remains, most of them, Israeli citizens. The cities have until recently been mostly free of unrest, but the latest unrest is exposing underlying tensions.
In the central city of Lod, the running battles between police and Israeli Arabs erupted again. This man was one of 15 arrested here. Police say they also confiscated an improvised submachine gun and 9 Molotov cocktails. In Haifa in the north, there were more police searches and 9 more people arrested on suspicion of rioting and attacking police. Not far away in Jizr az-Zarqa, Arabs and police faced off across a burning barricade before clashes that led to 2 more arrests. In Jaffa, a mostly Arab district of Tel Aviv, the streets lay quiet after a night of violence that saw an Arab child seriously wounded when a firebomb was thrown into his home. Some were determined to go about their daily business regardless, but many prefer to stay inside, fearing the civil war of which Israel's Prime Minister has warned.
Now, several thousand people in Sydney have marked the Palestinian National Day with a protest against Israel's attacks on Gaza. Demonstrators marched carrying Palestinian flags and chanting slogans condemning Israel. Nakba Day commemorates the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs during the first Arab-Israeli war. That conflict began on this day more than 7 decades ago.
When Britain officially withdrew from Palestine in May 1948, Jewish leaders announced the creation of a new state to be known as Israel. To many Palestinians, though, the day is known as Nakba, also called the Palestinian catastrophe. What followed was a bloody conflict between Arab states and Israel, and for Palestinians, a memory of displacement never forgotten. For them, Nakba is a day rooted in historical tragedy. but its symbolism is still felt strongly today, with the fight for statehood still ongoing. Many Palestinians hope by continuing to assert their culture, it will keep the collective sense of nationhood alive and potentially undo the Nakba. The day is normally marked with demonstrations, not just in the Palestinian territories, but all over the world. At times, the events have turned into confrontations with Israeli security forces. The recent unrest, sparked by the potential eviction of Palestinians from their homes by Israeli authorities, will add more fuel to the fire for those commemorating this day.
People are also marking Nakba Day right here in Berlin. DW reporter Jared Reed is at one of the demonstrations. Jared, what's happening where you are?
Hi, Michael. I'm in Neukölln, which is one of the districts in central Berlin. There are between 2,000 to 3,000 people that are marching along the streets here in one of 3 planned protests for Gaza solidarity. It's a little bit rowdy. I was at another position earlier. Oh, sorry.
You can see that Jared Reed is now being moved to a different position. We heard earlier, before we actually took this live shot from him, that he might have to leave that position because things were getting rowdy, and in fact, now we're seeing it happening in real time.
Michael,
Jared, can you still hear me?
You can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Michael, I've just been, I've got some security guys here. They've moved me to the side. Basically, it's a little bit rowdy here. The crowd had been marching along this street. It's called Sonnenallee. They'd been marching in this direction. About 10 minutes ago, the police stopped them and forced them to come back in the direction in which they had originally come. And just at the moment, we can see police. It's escalating behind me. There are police. I've just been told that there is some fighting happening between some of the crowds and the police. There is a heavy police presence at this protest here. I think you can see some police, and they're forcing the crowds back. The crowds are running back.
Jared, that crowd is moving towards you. We're going to let you get to some safety and maybe come back to you when this calms down. Get safe.
Okay.
That's DW's Jared Reed in Berlin in the middle of what seems to be a highly volatile crowd.